Morning changed the tone of everything. Night had carried voices, daylight carried names. What had been said in a restaurant did not stay there, not because it was shouted, but because it was shared, quietly, precisely, by people who had slept badly and woken up knowing that silence would now feel heavier than speaking. Statements were written, dates remembered. The same word, used casually repeatedly, appeared again and again, not as rumor, but as pattern. Men who had never thought of themselves as participants found their names attached to what they had seen and heard. Women who had flinched over coffee cups described the tone, the ease, the familiarity of the insult. Elijah's years were counted, not as service rendered, but as harm endured. Martin did not hover. He did not perform follow-ups. He did what he had said he would do. He documented, connected, and stepped aside so process could move without spectacle. Justice, he reminded those who asked him what would happen next, does not require my voice to keep going once it has found its footing. Inspections came without ceremony. Records were requested without argument. Policies that had lived as habits were suddenly asked to live on paper. The owner argued at first about intent, about pressure, about misunderstanding, but patterns do not negotiate. They are examined. And examined patterns do not flatter the people who made them. When the doors finally closed, it was not announced as punishment. It was announced as failure. Failure to meet standards that had been clear all along. The sign went up quietly. The street kept moving. Some diners shook their heads. Others nodded once and kept walking. No one cheered. Elijah did not celebrate either. He sat on a bench in the afternoon light, breathing easier than he had in years, the future uncertain but no longer poisoned by the certainty of daily contempt. When asked how he felt, he said only, lighter. Someone later asked Martin if the speech had closed the place. He shook his head. Words reveal, he said. They don't enforce. Enforcement belongs to a community willing to look. Another asked if he felt satisfied. Martin paused, then answered with the calm of a man who had learned to measure victories differently. I feel warned, he said, because this did not begin in that room, and it will not end with that door. What remained was not a legend of a man who walked in to eat and walked out to change everything. What remained was a record of witnesses who chose to remember, of a pattern that finally met daylight, of a truth that did not shout but refused to leave. And somewhere between the clink of plates and the turning of keys, a simple lesson settled where it belonged. A place can be owned by one man, but it is judged by all. And when dignity is denied as routine, the building itself eventually learns to close. The owner stood very still after the silence settled, as if movement might break whatever fragile order remained. And when he finally spoke, his voice no longer carried performance or certainty, only the thin edge of a man realizing that the ground beneath him had shifted without permission. I didn't think, he began, then stopped, because the sentence had nowhere honest to go. He cleared his throat. I didn't think it mattered how I talked. It was just words. Martin did not interrupt. He knew that confessions rush become excuses, and excuses are only another form of defense. The owner looked around the room now, really looked, and for the first time seemed to notice that the faces were not aligned with him anymore. Some were stern, some uncertain, some openly ashamed. This was not a jury he had chosen. I worked hard for this place, he said quieter. I built it from nothing. People come here because it runs, because I keep order. A man near the back spoke up, voice shaky but firm. Order isn't calling an old man that name. Another added, we've heard it before. We just didn't say anything. The owner turned sharply. So now it's my fault you stayed silent? The room answered at once, murmurs colliding, voices overlapping. You said it. We should have stopped it. He didn't deserve it. It was wrong and you know it. The owner raised his hands, overwhelmed. I'm saying I was wrong, he said. Isn't that what you want? Martin stepped in then, not to condemn, not to comfort, but to define the moment before it slipped away. Admission, he said calmly, is not the same as repair. The owner looked at him. What do you want from me? Martin's answer did not come like a demand. It came like a process. I want you to understand, he said, that repentance is not a feeling you express tonight. It is a change you submit to tomorrow. Words can open a door. Action decides whether you walk through it. Elijah shifted, the mop still in his hand. His voice was low, almost apologetic, as if he feared asking for too much. "I just want to work without being hated," he said. That simple sentence landed harder than any argument. The owner closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something like defeat there. Not theatrical, not noble, but real. "I was wrong," he said again, this time without looking for agreement. "I treated you like less than a man." Some diners nodded. Others crossed their arms, unconvinced. "That doesn't erase years," a woman said. "No," Martin replied, "but it does mark a beginning, if it is followed." The owner swallowed. "I'll make it right." "How?" someone asked. The question hung unanswered, because everyone understood that apologies are cheap in rooms where damage has been expensive. Martin looked around once more, committing faces to memory, then spoke with quiet finality. "What happens next will not be decided here alone," he said. "It will be decided by daylight, by records, by patterns examined without anger and without mercy. Confession does not end consequence. It invites it." The room fell silent again. Not the silence of fear this time, but the silence of witnesses who knew they had crossed from spectators into responsibility. And the owner, standing amid his own walls, finally understood that recognition was only the beginning, and that the question now was not whether he was forgiven, but whether this place would be allowed to continue as it had. Martin did not leave the block. He stepped into the cool air, let it steady his breath, and then turned back. Because there are moments when walking away would feel like peace, but would plant injustice deeper. And this was not one of those moments. When he re-entered, the room sensed it immediately, the way a congregation senses when the sermon is no longer optional. He did not stand on a chair. He did not ask for silence. He simply spoke, and the room leaned toward him. "You have heard a name used here," Martin began, voice measured, resonant, until it lost its shock and gained a rhythm. "That is how hatred survives, by becoming familiar." He paused, letting the sentence find its place. "But Scripture tells us that death and life are in the power of the tongue, and every word we repeat is either building a house for dignity or digging a pit for the soul." The owner shifted, arms crossed, jaw tight. Martin did not look at him yet. "There is a lie that says money gives permission," Martin continued. "Permission to wound, to belittle, to grind a man down because the ledger allows it. But the book of Amos speaks plainly. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Justice does not ask who owns the land. It asks who has been crushed upon it." A hush spread. No forks, no whispers. Elijah stood very still. Martin finally turned to the owner. "You have said this is your place, but I tell you, a place is not owned by walls alone. It is owned by what is practiced inside them. And when cruelty is practiced daily, it becomes doctrine." The owner scoffed. "You preaching now?" "I am reminding," Martin replied, calm. "For the gospel also says that a man who knows the good he ought to do and does not do it sins by omission. And tonight, omission has had many helpers." He faced the room again. "Some of you looked away to keep your meal warm. Some of you stayed silent to keep your evening intact. I understand the temptation. But hear this. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me. Not tomorrow, not in theory, tonight." The owner's voice cut in, strained. "You don't get to judge me." "I do not," Martin said. "Judgment is not my work. Exposure is." He stepped closer, not invading, but unavoidable. "This man," he nodded toward Elijah, "has borne insult upon insult while carrying sickness at home and pain in his own body. You called it management. Heaven calls it theft, the theft of dignity." A breath passed through the room like wind through dry leaves. "And hear this," Martin said, softer now, more dangerous. "A house divided against human worth cannot stand. Not forever. The same scriptures that promise mercy also promise reckoning. For what a man sows, that shall he also reap." He stopped speaking. He let the silence do what words had finished. The owner opened his mouth, closed it, then spoke again, quieter than before. I didn't mean..." Martin held up a hand, gentle. Meaning is not the measure. Pattern is. Elijah's shoulders lifted as he drew a deeper breath than he had all night. The room did not applaud. It did something harder. It accepted responsibility. And in that acceptance, the owner felt the ground change beneath him, not from anger, but from the weight of truth settling where it could no longer be ignored. The room didn't erupt the way the owner expected. It settled. Forks rested, chairs stopped shifting. People leaned in, not toward drama, but toward meaning. And the owner felt that slow, terrifying withdrawal of consent that no amount of volume can reverse once it begins. "You're twisting this," he said, voice tight now. "Old men exaggerate. They confuse correction with insult." Elijah didn't answer. He stood with the mop against his shoulder, breathing carefully, conserving strength the way some people conserve money. Martin watched the rhythm of his chest and understood how long this man had been rationing himself. Martin turned to the diners. "How many of you," he asked quietly, "have heard that word used here before tonight?" No hands rose. No one said no. Silence answered, thick and unmistakable. Martin nodded. "Silence is not ignorance," he said. "It is often proof." The owner scoffed. "You think dinner guests decide how I run my place?" "No," Martin replied. "A city does." That word shifted the air. It pulled the moment out of the room and into something larger, something the owner could not shout down. "There are labor board," Martin continued, even and precise, "civil statutes, inspections, and human standards that don't vanish because a man owns property. Patterns of abuse attract attention. Attention attracts action." "You're bluffing," the owner said, but it sounded thin. "I don't bluff," Martin answered. "I document." He turned to Elijah. "Has your health ever been used against you here?" Elijah nodded. "When I sit, he calls me useless. When I cough, he says not to get sickness on white people's food." A murmur moved through the room. Recognition, not surprise. "And your wife?" Martin asked. "She's ill," Elijah said. "I can't miss days." "That's not my responsibility," the owner snapped. "No," Martin said softly, "but your cruelty is." He faced the room again. "This restaurant does not exist alone. It exists inside a community, inside laws, inside conscience. When a business teaches hatred as daily practice, it forfeits the protection of privacy." "You don't shut me down over words," the owner said. "No," Martin replied. "You shut yourself down by repeating them." He reached for his coat, not to retreat, but to signal process. "This does not end here," he said calmly. "Tomorrow this room becomes testimony." As he turned toward the door, the owner understood too late that the danger was not the speech still to come, but the action that would follow, carried by witnesses who would no longer forget. When fear stopped working, the owner reached for authority. He snapped his fingers toward the counter, and moments later the manager appeared, followed by a thick-set man who looked less like security and more like pressure. "This man is disrupting my business," the owner said, pointing at Martin. "I want him out." The manager hesitated, eyes moving from Martin to Elijah, still standing with the mop upright. "Sir," he said carefully, "maybe we should calm this down." "I said now," the owner snapped. The stocky man took a step forward. Chairs shifted. People leaned back, instinctively making space, because enforcement always looks heavier up close. Martin didn't raise his voice or his hands. He turned to the manager. "Before you decide," he said evenly, "you should understand what you're defending." "My livelihood," the owner cut in. "And his," Martin replied, nodding toward Elijah, "has been broken here for years." "I don't know anything about that," the manager said. "That," Martin answered, "is the problem." The owner laughed sharply and addressed the room. "I give an old man a job, and suddenly I'm the villain." "You took his dignity," a woman near the window said. "That doesn't concern you," the owner snapped. "It does now," another voice added. "We all heard what you called him." The owner froze, as if the room itself had turned against him. "This is harassment," he said. "I won't tolerate it." "When the same slur is used for years," Martin said to the room, "it stops being a word. It becomes a condition of employment." The manager shifted, uneasy. "Sir," he said to the owner, "maybe we should step back." "No," the owner replied. "I want this finished." "So do I." Martin said quietly. You think you can ruin me? The owner snapped. I've got licenses, inspections, friends. Then scrutiny shouldn't frighten you, Martin replied. He turned to Elijah. How long have you worked here? Don't answer, the owner barked. Elijah hesitated, then spoke, voice shaking but clear. 7 years. And how often? Martin asked gently. Has he called you that name? Elijah swallowed. Most days. The room exhaled as one. The owner opened his mouth to deny it, to explain it away, but the words had already done their damage. This was no longer a dispute. It was a pattern spoken aloud, in front of people who could no longer pretend they hadn't heard it. The manager took half a step back, and in that small movement, the owner felt it. The moment when authority begins to slip, not because someone louder replaced it, but because truth had been allowed to stand in the room. The owner felt the room slipping from his grip, and men like that never retreat quietly. They press harder, turning humiliation into routine spectacle so everyone remembers who commands and who obeys. He raised his voice just enough to make it public again. Don't stop, he snapped. Keep moving, nigger. My customers don't come here to watch you rest. The word cut through the air, not with shock, but with familiarity, as if it had been sharpened by years of use. The old man flinched, shoulders tightening, then pushed the mop forward again, slower now, his breath shallow and uneven. Martin saw the strain in the way the man leaned into the handle, saw pain when another small argument against pride. A man near the back muttered, "That's enough," but stayed seated. A woman whispered to her husband. No one stood. The owner smiled, encouraged. See, he said to Martin. He understands. They always do. Martin stepped closer, not threatening, not loud, just enough to narrow the space where cruelty lived. You are mistaking silence for consent, he said, and obedience for agreement. The owner laughed and turned to the room. Hear that? A philosopher at dinner. He gestured at the janitor. If I don't talk to him like this, he forgets who signs the checks. The janitor's hand slipped. The mop clattered softly against the tile. He froze. The owner's face hardened. Pick it up. The old man bent, slower than before, his knee giving way for a breathless second. Martin saw it and stepped between them without touching either, a quiet interruption that changed the balance of the room. Enough, Martin said. The owner leaned in, voice low and sharp. You don't tell me enough in my own place. This stopped being yours alone, Martin replied. The moment you turned cruelty into a public ritual. The owner sneered. I've called him that name for years. No one stopped me. Years, Martin repeated softly, then turned to the room. If this has been happening for years, tonight isn't an incident. It's evidence. The word moved through the room. Heads lifted, eyes met. People understood this might not stay contained. The owner snapped at the diners. You going to let him threaten my livelihood? Martin didn't answer. He looked at the old man, who stood still now, mop upright, breathing hard, eyes no longer on the floor. Sir, Martin said gently, what is your name? Don't answer, the owner barked. The old man hesitated, then spoke. Elijah. The room shifted. A name had weight. Thank you, Elijah, Martin said. This is over, the owner snapped. Back to work. But it wasn't over, because names linger and witnesses remember. And once a man is fully seen, cruelty never feels as safe as it did moments before. The owner didn't shrink under attention. It fed him. He straightened his jacket, rolled his shoulders back, and spoke louder. Not shouting, just enough to remind the room who he believed he was. This, he said, gesturing toward the floor, is what happens when sympathy runs a business. Weak work, weak people. He nudged the mop handle with his shoe. Do it again. The old man bent lower without a word. His breathing had turned uneven, a shallow rasp that betrayed pain he was trying to hide. Martin noticed the way the janitor's free hand pressed briefly against his side, steadying himself before moving again. This was no slip of temper. It was routine, practiced, and the room knew it. You always move like that, the owner continued, casual as a habit. Slow, tired, expecting the world to wait. You should be grateful a white man still pays you at all. A chair scraped somewhere behind Martin, then went still. No one intervened. Silence had learned where it belonged here. Martin spoke without rising from his seat. "Is this how you speak to him every day?" The owner turned, surprised, then amused. "Every day he earns it." "That man," Martin said, nodding toward the janitor, "is old enough to be your father." The owner shrugged. Then he should know his place. Something shifted. Not noise, awareness. Faces lifted. Forks paused. What had been spectacle was becoming record. "You call this private business," Martin went on, steady and precise. "But when a place survives by breaking the same man again and again, it stops being private. It becomes public harm." The owner laughed. "You threatening me?" "No," Martin replied. "I'm warning you." The word landed. Not loud, final. The owner's smile thinned. "You don't know who I am. I've got permits, licenses, friends downtown. You don't shut a restaurant because some old—" He hesitated, then finished anyway. "Because a worker can't keep up." Martin stood slowly. The room followed the movement as if pulled by gravity. "There are laws that speak even when people are silent," he said, "and patterns of abuse that draw attention, whether their owners invite it or not. You think a speech closes my doors?" The owner scoffed. Martin met his eyes. "Places like this close themselves the moment the truth walks out with witnesses." The janitor paused, gripping the mop, and looked up, not at the owner, but at Martin, because the fight in the room had become more than words now. It had become a question of consequence. Memphis, Tennessee, a narrow downtown restaurant on Lorraine Street, April 3rd, 1968. 46 people inside. Martin Luther King Jr. walked in that night wanting something painfully simple: a chair, a plate of food, and a short stretch of quiet where the world would not demand words from him, because even men who carry movements still feel hunger and fatigue. What he did not expect, what he could never have prepared for, was to step into a cruelty so routine, so rehearsed, that it had already stopped shocking the people forced to witness it. The first thing he noticed was the janitor, an old black man, well past the age where his body should still be bending over wet tile, moving a mop slowly, carefully, as if each step had to be negotiated with aching joints and shallow breath. His hands shook, one knee dragged slightly, and there was something fragile in the way he paused between strokes. The quiet language of a man who worked not because he was strong, but because stopping was not an option. Later, people would say his wife was sick, that the medicine drained whatever little money they had, that his own health was failing too. But none of that needed explaining if you knew how to look. Then came the voice. "Move it, nigger," the owner said casually, without anger, without effort. "I don't pay you to crawl around like some worn-out animal." The word landed clean and open, like it had been used here before. The old man stiffened for half a second, then lowered his eyes and kept mopping, because experience had taught him that stopping only invited more pain. "I'm doing it," he said quietly. "Just slow today." The owner stepped closer, polished shoes tapping the tile. "You're always slow," he replied. "That's what happens when they let your kind work past usefulness. Weak, tired, and still thinking patience applies to you." A woman near the window clenched her jaw. A man in a suit stared into his plate. Someone laughed softly, then stopped, unsure why they had done it. Martin hadn't even sat down yet. He stood near the entrance, coat over his arm, watching the owner lean in with the comfort of a man who had humiliated this same worker many times before because repetition had turned cruelty into habit. "I tell you every day," the owner continued, "if you don't like it, leave. Plenty of young black boys outside who'd take your place." The old man nodded once and pushed the mop harder, hands trembling now from exhaustion more than fear. It was obvious this wasn't new, and the room knew it too because no one looked surprised. Martin chose a table along the side wall, not to hide but to stay. He sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the space where power pressed down and dignity bent under it. The owner finally noticed him watching. "What?" he snapped. "You got something to say?" Martin folded his napkin with deliberate calm. "I came here to eat," he said evenly, "but it seems something else is being served." "Mind your business," the owner scoffed. Martin glanced back at the old man, still working through pain, then returned his gaze to the owner. "Some things," he said quietly, become everyone's business the moment cruelty gets comfortable. The owner smiled, already preparing another insult, unaware that this time the witness in the room was not going to look away, and that a quiet dinner had just turned into something history would refuse to forget.